Good morning. My name's Seth Lazar. I'm a professor of philosophy at the ANU, where I lead a project on the morality, law, and politics of data and AI. I'm delighted to welcome you to this, the second in the Automated Decision-Making in Society seminar series in alternative data governance and alternative data economies. The series is hosted by the Automated Decision-Making in Society ARC Centre of Excellence in collaboration with the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne and the ANU's Humanising Machine Intelligence project. Our various universities and centres are based throughout Australia, and on behalf of us all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to culture, community, land, sea and sky. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. So this seminar series, organised by Jake Goldenfein, got off to a fantastic start 2 weeks ago with Jake's interview of Katerina Pistor and Salome Fulvione. What I appreciate about it especially is how it moves forward from the framing of, if you like, critical data studies to think about what modes of political and economic governance we can imagine to find a path forward from where we are now. In 2 weeks, we're going to focus on organizations and intermediaries. In 4 weeks, we'll consider democratic politics. Today, however, our topic is disciplining the market or being the market. Our discussion leader for today is Professor Kimberly Weatherall of the University of Sydney. Among her many leadership roles in the Australian community working on AI and society, she's a chief investigator of the Automated Decision-Making and Society Centre of Excellence. Kim, if you would please take the proverbial mic.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you for all those introductions. So it is really exciting to have Professor Julie Cohen and Associate Professor Kean Birch with us today for this second in the series, Disciplining the Market or Being the Market. So as Seth was saying last time, we were talking about data and the governance of data. In this session, we're going to turn our attention to platforms and the way that they aren't just a spot where market transactions happen to occur, but effectively can become the market and can entirely restructure the way that people transact, both socially, economically, politically, so across all of the important domains in life. There's been a lot of discussion publicly around the use of antitrust and competition law to deal with what's going on with platforms and their multi-sidedness, network effects, etc. But we wanted to explore what the trajectory of these developments has been, where platforms are going, how they are reconfiguring our relationships and transactions, and whether there's scope for thinking about ways other than just, important as competition law is, ways that there are other ways to think about how we deal with platforms, their role, and think about what kind of different, I think, regulatory thinking we need for this new environment. Because in a lot of ways, it seems like many of our old tools aren't working very well. And we couldn't have a better couple of speakers to think about these things. We're extremely fortunate to have Professor Julie Cohen from the Georgetown Law Centre, who is a leading thinker, has long been a leading thinker in the space of data, background in intellectual property. I first encountered her work in this space through her book, Configuring the Network Self, where she thought very deeply about questions of privacy in this new environment. And author of the book, Between Truth and Power, which examined the whole trajectory of information capitalism and was an important, I think, legal response to the discussions that we've had since Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism. We also have Associate Professor Kean Birch from York University, from Kean, from the Science and Technology Studies program there. He's the author too of many books right in this space. I'm looking at his publication list right now. 2020, we have the edited collection Assetization, Turning Things into Assets in Techno-Scientific Capitalism. And techno-scientific capitalism, what this market now looks like with this technology in this environment with all of these models is precisely the space that he's been working in. So I'm utterly delighted to have both of these speakers with us today and looking forward to the discussion. The way we're going to structure today is we're going to have short presentations, not great long ones, from Kean and then from Julie. And then I have a series of questions that I wanted to explore more deeply, or, you know, bring up to an Australian audience for a lot of the themes that they've been dealing with. Then we'll throw to our awesome panel of people that you can see on the screen at the moment, a terrific bunch of researchers from our 3 centres, from ADM+S, from HMI, and from CADE, who have promised to be very, you know, engaged and interactive and ask very intelligent questions. And then we'll an opportunity for questions from the broader audience. So that's the plan, that's the running order. Looking forward to the discussion. And at this point, I'd really like to just hand over to Kean to start us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Kimberly. So it's great to be here, and you know, my thanks to Jake, Lauren, Kimberly, and Seth for their roles in organising this. I'm going to do briefly talk about this idea of automated neoliberalism today, and I look forward to questions afterwards. So to start, I have to admit that I sometimes struggle with the concept of neoliberalism. I've been using it analytically for a good 15 years now, but I found that over time it's become less and less useful, and I think that there are other tools that are emerging that are becoming more helpful. That being said, I'm still, I still engage with it, and this is a talk where I'm trying to engage with neoliberalism within the within contemporary capitalism, whether we want to call it techno-scientific or informational or surveillance or what have you. I just want to have thank Jason Sadowski, whose article "The Internet of Landlords" was a kind of inspiration for this paper. And helped me to think a little bit about this kind of notion of the automation of neoliberalism. So to start with, then I'm going to just discuss a little bit. I'm going to discuss neoliberalism a little bit as my kind of starting point, and then I'll talk about this automation idea of neoliberalism and automation of markets, and then I'll finish with a discussion of reflexivity. I'm trying to keep my eye on the time, so I will try and keep myself to the 10 minutes, and I will get on with it now. So my starting point then is neoliberalism is generally thought of as this kind of notion of the installation of markets, market competition as the key institution in society. But the problem arises then when we think about this era of big tech, where we're in at the minute, where you have market concentration, market power, monopolies, and the wholesale replacing of markets with with digital platforms that then are regulated by these large organizations. There seems to be some incompatibility here. But I think that we can match up this, what's happening with this notion of neoliberalism if we unpack neoliberalism a little bit more and think about the the kind of specific ways that it is understood by neoliberals themselves. So the neoliberals themselves is they have multiple notions of what a market is and the social role of the market and the ways that market organize society. And I think there's at least 4 different conceptions of markets within neoliberal thought. The kind of hierarchian notion of markets as these evolving, as the a kind of evolutionary information processes that lead to a better future. A more kind of Friedmanite notion of markets being this kind of idealistic starting condition for the efficient allocation of resources in society. The kind of Gary Becker position, which is I would characterize as being this idea that society is already in a market, and we can understand society already as a market. But perhaps the most interesting, and the one I want to focus on here, is the perspective of Richard Posner, so the legal scholar Richard Posner. And in a great book by Sonia Amadei called Prisoners of Reason, she kind of talks about the perspective of Richard Posner, who's like Becker, assumes that society is already a market, and so you just need to work out what markets should do, and then we can just get on with assigning through legal processes and so on, assigning the rights that reflect the most suitable market outcome, most efficient kind of outcome. And so we can decide, make decisions on the basis of this kind of as-if markets without needing actual market operations. And I think that Posner's vision is reflected in some of the kind of key changes around notions of market design that emerge in policy and political thinking. There's a great book by Phil Murawski and Eddie Nickar where they talk about the ascendance of market design, basically, and the shift of economists away from looking at markets towards agents, and the kind of jettisoning the idea that markets are good mechanisms for identifying individual preferences and allocating resources, and rather taking up this idea that with market design we can design markets in whatever ways we want in order to achieve the outcomes we want. And so you end up with this construction of these kinds of quasi as-if markets. So in thinking through some of these issues around this kind of notion of these kind of as-if quasi markets, I started thinking about digital technology, the dominance of big tech, and the ways that we can think about the automation of markets, basically, through this emergence of market design and the marrying together of that with the digital technologies. And I thought about this on at least on 3 levels. So I'm sure there are other ways of thinking about this. One around the automation of supply and demand through platforms. One around the automation of prices and pricing through the collection of personal data and data analytics. And the final one around the automation of contracts through distributed electronic ledger technologies, blockchain, essentially. So just trying to be aware of time here, I'll briefly discuss each of these and then go on to the final kind of issue, which I think is complicates some of this discussion around data governance. So the first one, the automation of supply and demand through platforms. We all know, I think we all kind of agree that platforms are some form of multi-sided market where you have intermediaries managing the supply and demand on their platforms. We can see different versions of this play out in different kinds of platforms. And what we end up here with the platforms is as I said, this mediation of supply and demand by these platforms that set the rules of the game, essentially. So a form of private regulation, where you might have a market being a participant, well, you might have a platform controller being a participant, but also being the one that sets the regulatory or the rules for the operations of that platform. And there are examples of this that there's some really good examples of this that come out of the US congressional report on markets and competition recently from last year. So things like Amazon, self-preferencing on its platform, Facebook controlling access to its social graph, Apple using its privacy policies in particular ways to disadvantage app developers and such like. And the end result of this is you end up with a series of kind of enclaves. A platform becomes an enclave, collecting data through users, charging access to this enclave and such like. The second one then is this notion of automating prices and pricing through data collection, data analytics. And this follows the massification of data collection and analysis, and largely done through forms of contractual arrangements like terms and conditions, and essentially experimentation on us without our consent, in the sense that we collect data and then use data analytics to make some particular decisions, etc. And this is supposed to enable forms of direct targeted marketing, dynamic pricing, as well as the kind of endpoint of working out the willingness of our willingness to pay for particular things. And you end up with a situation in which certain people benefit while others don't. And so Marion Foucault and Kieran Healy talk about the people who have this what they call is kind of higher status, digital status than others, and that leads to them receiving perks essentially. The final then is around this automation of contracting through blockchain, distributed electronic ledgers, through the implementation of smart contracts. So the idea that you can do away with kind of incomplete contracting by rolling out a contract with actuality. And it's underpinned by the assumption that the future is all knowable, and ignores any notion of uncertainty, which is a point that Katharina Pistor makes in her book Code of Capital. And she points out that this then ends up meaning you can gain these smart contracts. And you end up reinforcing the kind of information power and asymmetries that exist through this automation of contracting. So the final point then is about reflexivity. So how do we understand data governance around this kind of automation of these platforms, pricing, and contracts when we start thinking about reflexivity? So the idea being that reflexivity being the idea that the knowledge claims or the knowledge we produce ends up changing the world and the behaviors of the things we learn about. And so I was thinking about this in relation to data. The more data we collect, the more it changes the behaviors and the actions of the people it's collected from. And so you end up with this constantly changing, fluid situation in which the more the data gets collected, the more that we change, and so on. And we end up with a kind of interesting situation in which it becomes harder and harder to tell whether the data that gets collected is actually useful as a consequence of the accumulation of all the little lies we tell on a daily basis about ourselves on social media and such like. And there are attempts, I think, as well here by companies to try and sidestep this reflexivity. So the firms that refuse to reveal their algorithms, like Google, firms that have a kind of opaque rule system like Amazon and such like, and then this leads to this kind of creation of a mini industry optimization experts, or experts who know how to deal with the kind of big tech vagaries. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
That's a terrific start, Kean. There's a lot to unpack in there, and I'm looking forward to unpacking it soon. Julie, I'll turn to you and ask you to give us a brief rundown on some of the big ideas that you've had in your work.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm going to just get this slide deck rolling. Oh, goodness. Hang on, resume share.
You are sharing at the moment, we can see that.
Okay, good. I'm sharing at the moment. You can see the slides. Thumbs up,
Correct.
yes. Okay, so thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate, and to Kean for that very interesting set of remarks. I'm gonna just speak about the question of disciplining the market or being the market from the perspective of this 2019 book, in which I took a Polanyian perspective on the question of platforms and what they are doing and what they're about. And I just need to ask for a thumbs up again, because if you can see the slides, because I'm getting a message that suggests that you can't see them.
We can see your slides, but we can see the full page. It's not in viewer mode at the moment.
Okay,
so
hang on just a second. This is not good. PowerPoint. Yes?
Much better. Yes,
perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. Technology is not my friend sometimes. So I find it useful to think about the, as I said, the question what platforms are about and what they're doing in terms of a process of transformation in political economy that has been underway for some time, and that fits pretty neatly by within kind of a Polanyian frame of sort of political economy / economic sociology, by analogy to some of the points that Polanyi made about the evolution of industrial capitalism. And so in his classic study, he just described a lot of very interesting sort of entailments of the transformation of the British system of political economy from an agrarian one to an industrial one, and talked about appropriation of inputs, but also about kind of a conceptual reorganization, a process of learning to see the inputs to production as commodities, which was sort of a new thing to be doing. And in particular, about learning to see labor, land, and money inputs to production as commodities. And as I'm sure you all know, he thought they were fictitious commodities because in fact, when pressed to behave like commodities, they would not, and all sorts of very interesting and calamitous failures ensued precisely from the failure of labor, land, and money to behave like commodities. But nonetheless, the transformation to an industrial and capitalist political economy demanded that these inputs be treated as commodities, and so they were. And there was also kind of an organizational change in which patterns of barter and exchange that were previously very easy to understand as local and contextualized and situated in their material places became sort of understood as detached and re-embedded in a fictitious construct called the market, which made it easy to develop entire theories about the market in terms of abstraction, right? In terms of sort of a fictional place where the forces of supply and demand encounter one another and they transact over goods, and we don't need to worry too much about those pesky and heterogeneous and hybrid places and materialities. And it struck me then, and it strikes me now, that the parallels are just really, really good between that analysis of the emergence of industrial capitalism and the transformation that has been underway during what some have called the long 20th century and now into the 21st, from industrial capitalism to informational capitalism. I say informational capitalism is a term that I have borrowed from Manuel Castells, and it refers to sort of the continuation of capitalism as a mode of production, but a shift toward informationalism as the preeminent mode of development. So knowledge accumulation, knowledge enclosure, so that surplus can be extracted from it in accordance with the dictates of the capitalist mode of production, increased complexity in information processing, etc. And you see these three shifts that parallel those that Polanyi chronicled in the prior transformation. A great emphasis on the appropriation of new resources that are needed as inputs to informational development, and now there's a lot of stress laid on intangible resources. I assume you're all well familiar with that. The inputs to production that had formerly, that sort of everyone had formerly had to learn to see as commodities, remain commodified, but now they become datafied as well, whether they become re-envisioned in terms of streams of datafied inputs to production, even land, right? And then there's a fourth one, which is data flows extracted from people. So people become datafied and commodified inputs to production as well. And then we see the emergence over decades, right? So it's not just social media, but over decades of platforms, which are interesting creatures because they are not abstractions the way the market is, right? Patterns of barter and exchange that had previously become detached from markets now become sort of rematerialized and re-embedded in platforms because platforms have protocols and platforms require conformity to their protocols. You know, the visible ones that we all love to argue about today in our disputes about disinformation and competition policy are ever present in the mind. But if you look back over the last several decades, platformization has been everywhere. It's been in terms of platforms for financial trading. Platforms have sort of infested all stages of the labor market and all stages of sort of transnational supply chain planning. Everything has become platformized, and platforms excel at taking these streams. So just a little bit of a deeper dive into datafication and platformization, if in case there are skeptics out there. I think a lot of the behavior that we've seen in labor markets in terms of sort of outsourcing of human resources and just-in-time flexible scheduling of workers, a lot of what's gone on in financial markets, a lot of what's gone on in terms of securitization of interests in land. All right, here we go. So, so platforms take these inputs, and again, not just our social media platforms, not just our Amazon and Palantir, but across all these different sectors where we've seen platformization. And what they do is they sort of, they perform and they instantiate and they entrench a new kind of infrastructure-based disintermediation of previous central market actors and a re-intermediation for their own benefit. And they rearrange the flows of data for access, right? So in terms of the theme of disciplining the market or being the market, I suppose you could say as they rearrange the flows of information, they are being the market. They're rearranging the flows of information to make them more legible to themselves, the platform intermediaries. So they're disciplining the market. They are extracting a whole lot of surplus from those flows, but at the end of the day, I would have to say they're neither disciplining nor being the market, but rather transforming the market, right? And that's the point back here. The market, in a sense, was always only ever a fictionalized construct, and it mapped well to the discourses of industrial capitalism. It's still, it's still performing a discursive role in the narratives of neoliberalism that Kean spoke about and that plenty of other people have written about, right? But the organizational logic of informational capitalism is not the market, it's the platform. And I think it's important then to understand platforms as transforming markets more than as either of the two options in the seminar series title. Now, I have no idea for how long I've been speaking, but I'll just do a little bit more. So my own sort of point of entry into this was a specific curiosity about the role that law and legal institutions play in producing this transformation, a specific frustration with a form of thinking about that encounter between law and political economic transformation to informational capitalism that sees law as sort of the passive thing that has to respond or get out of the way or do something in reaction to the transformation that is going on. And that's very clearly not the case, right? And it was very clearly not the case in the first transformation from agrarianism to industrial capitalism. You couldn't have done the things that were done kind of in the name of inventing and entrenching industrial capitalism without using legal institutions to do those things, right? You had to constitute corporations and sort of ravage the natural resources of the world and appropriate them and invent capital and you know, go read your Katharina Pastor for some of that, and definitely read your Polanyi. Law doesn't just respond or get out of the way, right? Law is mobilized to produce not just the protective counter movement, but to produce the transformation in the first place, the thing that makes the protective counter movement necessary. And in fact, what we see and what then I sort of delved into at great and gory book length detail is all of the ways in which law is mobilized and deputized to engage in legal entrepreneurship around making this transformation happen and making it happen in a way that benefits interested parties. And so you do see the large platform firms and other large and powerful tech economy actors again, mobilizing legal tools, right? Re-optimizing structures that will aid their sort of surplus extractive projects, particularly around intellectual property rights, particularly around certain forms of corporate law that are more efficient for those purposes, particularly around sort of not just reorganizing the built environment for ease of data harvesting, but propagating narratives that forward the project of data harvesting by sort of constituting all of our data as a public domain that is available for interested parties to appropriate. And then by using other narratives of enclosure and appropriation to justify the way that they lay claim to the data, and again, work to extract surplus from it. We see other narratives being mobilized around baseline relations of accountability and disempowerment. Generally and unsurprisingly, the disempowerment sort of redounds to ordinary people, right? And the immunity from accountability redounds to the benefit of platforms and data brokers and the like. But it's contested and performative, right? There are these narratives of responsibility. State actors say you must remove terrorist speech, or you must remove hate speech, or you must remove, child pornography. And platforms agree that some of it should be removed, but there is then a tussle, right? A contestation over who gets to control how that is done. And at the end of the day, when the dust settles, very often you have these sort of performative accountability structures like the Facebook Oversight Board, right? But a lot of sort of self-governance being done internally without a whole lot of accountability for how that happens. And these are all sort of processes of legal entrepreneurship that are going on. And then there's a whole nother side of the story to tell, which is sort of outside the frame of this seminar session. So I'm not going to trouble you with it unless people want to talk about it more. That has to do with sort of reshaping forms of legal institutions themselves to make these other projects work more smoothly. So I think that's probably enough from me for purposes of getting the conversation going. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to revert the hosting back to whoever gave it to me in the first place. And I'll turn it then over to you, Kimberly.
That's terrific. Thank you, Julie. And I think we've already taken the hosting away from you, so don't worry about that.
Oh, perfect. Great.
That's great. There is so much that I want to unpack and discuss in all of that with both of you. I'll start with a question about the platforms as they are effectively, you both talked about the way that the platforms are like market designers getting to set the rules and design the rules. If they are designing the rules, if they are effectively setting the rules of these quasi-markets to get the outcome they want, they can redesign those rules at any time, I assume. So, and what's the impact of that on participants in these markets? Kean, I might turn to you first.
Sure, thanks for the question. So I think this is this is something that we can see play out in like the US congressional hearings that I already mentioned, where you had the hearings on the big tech, competition, digital markets, I think, and competition. And so there was some really interesting testimony that we got to hear there from a range of different people, including the CEOs of the big tech companies that were kind of asked to testify, basically. And I think that there's some of the examples of this kind of ability to redesign the rules as they wish, play out in pretty problematic ways when you look at the impacts that these large companies, well, especially the large companies, the large platform companies, the impacts that they can have. So things like withdrawing of access to, I think in one case was a discussion of Facebook and its withdrawing of access to its social graph, for example. That was seen as a big issue. So the social graph is it's kind of all the information on the on people that connects all these people together in this big kind of social network, and so it's a really useful resource for companies who want to develop new products, services, etc. But in order to access it, they need to sign over certain things so that they don't end up competing with Facebook, and Facebook can withdraw access at at any moment. So it's a problem if you are if you are that company that's reliant on it. Another example would be Amazon. So sellers, third-party sellers on Amazon who their livelihoods depend upon what seems to them to often be a very arcane, Kafkaesque kind of system of regulation of their actions, and so they can can suffer again the same sort of thing where they are blocked from selling on Amazon, and they may not actually understand the reason why, and then they have to go through a whole process of trying to get back onto the platform. A final one would be Apple and app developers and the kind of their need of app developers to follow the policies or to get kicked off the app store.
That's great, thanks. Julie, did you have a comment on that? I know that you're also interested in the power that platforms have to shape these interactions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that they're playing a much more sophisticated game than I think is suggested by the narrative that they can just make the rules and change the rules whenever they want, right? The game they're playing is about sort of imbuing their authority over all things, transactional and algorithmic with sort of an aura of being natural and organic and right, and a matter of their entitlements. And there are categories that get naturalized, right? So it matters a lot. There is information that flows within data-driven algorithmic processes internal to the platform about which sellers and buyers get prioritized and so on. At present, largely completely opaque to the rest of us, except for the occasional journalist that gets lucky doing black box testing. And it is important to understand that the narratives that are told about those processes are under construction, right? Are the processes themselves knowable, right? Are the processes proprietary? Are the processes expressive? Are the processes the organic result of people, buyers and sellers being matched with what they want, which is sort of that narrative of the market that we're now in the process of transcending being used to do work, right? It's not, none of those people, right, is dumb enough to show up in Congress and just say we get to make the rules the way we want, right? Even though I'm sure, they might wish to, but there are incredible sort of structures of performative accountability being created in certain domains, right? So let us put up a transparency report. Let us show you the many thousands of items of information that we have or not show you, right? Because we're not going to show you anything. Let us tell you that we have taken down 12,000 pieces of information about hate speech and, 18,573 pieces of information about child pornography. We're not going to tell you the denominator, right? We're not going to tell you the hash function that we use to search for them. We're not going to really tell you, how they circulated within groups or pages. We're not going to tell you how our algorithms uprank them for engagement, but we are going to have a whole bunch of narrative around transparency reporting to make it seem that we are putting rules in place. Now, I recognize I'm answering you in a way that blurs competition policy and disinformation policy concerns. And I'm doing that deliberately because it's all the same on the back end. But it is very much more complicated than just, we get to make the rules however we want, right? They are invested in creating narratives that within which their processes represent a kind of rule by law, even if not rule of law in a way.
Wow, thank you for that. That's terrific. Just going to those questions of data and information capitalism. One thing that struck me in reading some of your recent work, Kean, was that you talked about data needing to flow, you know, that data was flowing around and people were making money from that, that it needed to flow for platform capitalism to work. But one of the interesting trajectories we're seeing at the moment, I think, is that the bigger platforms are taking a lot of steps to limit the way that data flows, or to shape the way that data is flowing, in order, you know, usually as some sort of, to turn to Julie's comment about narratives, they talk about this as a privacy thing, like we're going to protect privacy by not allowing people access to all of this data of ours. So is this shift still about data flow for profit, or are we automating that away as well? Is that a new stage where we're trying to cut off people's access, or other firms' access to data? Kean.
Yeah, I did it. I left my my mute on. Yeah, so yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that there's an emerging conflict, I guess, here, and I think this is something that was highlighted in a recent Wired article by Gilad Edelman, which is basically about this conflict between privacy and competition. So on the one hand, you have, according to Edelman, basically it was like Facebook's being sued for, you know, reducing privacy, and on the other hand, you know, Google's being sued for increasing privacy. So you have this kind of conflict that's going on around what does the extension of privacy mean when it comes to competition. And I think there's, you know, I think that there's a, you know, there are some people who think that the opening up of the data would lead to a burgeoning of competition and an expansion of you know, essentially the erosion of the market power. I'm not sure like how you go about doing that. I think this relates specifically to issues of interoperability and how you go about forcing companies to enable you know, the transfer of data from, you know, one platform to another platform, or, you know, and so on. And so there's all sorts of issues around, you know, data governance here that are fascinating, that that require you know, particular kinds of intervention that I'm not sure whether the state or the governments are, you know, either willing to pursue or necessarily have the wherewithal maybe to pursue at the minute. And so I think there's some really interesting possibilities that could emerge over the next, you know, few years. And you know, I'm keeping an eye on Europe at the minute, because Europe's got all these new Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, this new AI regulation, all these sorts of things that are coming out that look very interesting. They have a very different way of regulating the market. You know, if we go back to neoliberalism, we could see their approach is more of the kind of ordo-liberalism side of neoliberalism, which is about, you know, setting the ground rules, the framework conditions for markets to operate, and having very strong framework there, and then you enable firms to operate within that, you know, those framework conditions, and that's their idea of competition, versus the North American, more kind of, I guess, Chicago style form of neoliberalism, which is a little bit less you know, state managed, if you like. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I'm not sure if that actually really answers your question about flows, but I think there's this conflict that's going on that we'll see play out in very interesting ways.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with that. One of the interesting things, we've, you know, Australia is another interesting one to look at actually with some of this, because we had the Digital Platforms Inquiry, and that talked a lot about privacy and how we needed to, you know, very much following a basic notice and consent model of privacy, but we needed to improve that. But sitting beside that, we have the same regulator, the ACCC, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, doing this digital advertising services inquiry, where their, you know, paper that they issued earlier in the year suggested that in order to solve some of the problems in the advertising market, you know, the fact that advertisers were getting screwed over by what was going on in some of the platforms, that the ACCC seemed to want to give more commercial parties access to information, but didn't quite join the dots on how that could be done in a privacy protective way. So you know, there are these sort of discussions around how you reconcile that privacy and making markets work better thing going on sort of piecemeal in Australia through some of these initiatives. It's and then there's the EFF white paper that they issued around, you know, ways to kind of extend that social graph in Facebook, which again is trying to reconcile that. Let's create competition by opening up some of this data, although that takes a perspective that effectively by creating competition, you will enable more privacy protective social media type networks to exist, which seems to exhibit a faith in the market I'm not entirely convinced by. Julie, did you have a comment on that question of like this different shift we have towards parties wanting to control their data and not keep access in the name of privacy?
So it's very complicated, right? So it's not even clear we all mean the same thing when we use the word privacy. It is quite clear that privacy is being weaponized in terms of competitive battles among different platforms, right? And so you know, the before we even get to what happened in Australia, right? The tug of war between Apple and Facebook over eliminating the capacity to be tracked in apps, right, is not necessarily something that would hit Apple the same way it would hit Facebook, right? Google's move to the flock tracking, right? Google Chrome's putting people in population cohorts and telling them that that protects their privacy is a super interesting and dare I say super cynical maneuver, right? Because it really plays up that notion of privacy as being entangled with individual assertion of control rights. But since it's all about sort of profiling populations, or perhaps in that classic, you know, Deleuzean sense, individuals, right? That's what is going on, right? And so to put the Google situation is not necessarily any more privacy protective. It just takes a different spin on how people's data are used. So we're clearly in a situation in which you know, the tech companies have sat up and recognized with varying degrees of cynicism that it behooves them to make privacy claims with varying degrees of seriousness and to sort of adjust their particular environments and their relationships within their sort of their own supply chains, right? Their app stores and so on and so forth around privacy. It's not clear that any of that should be called privacy protective in any meaningful sense. And it is, I think, important to kind of disentangle the question of benefit from the question of control. It's not necessarily going to further your privacy in any meaningful sense to allow you to check boxes yes or no. And we're still in quite rudimentary stages, I would suggest, in terms of thinking about how privacy might be furthered through design in ways that none of the big firms are really seriously doing yet.
Okay.
Can I follow up on that? Is it? So I think the privacy is okay. Thank you. Privacy is really interesting for because just looking at, as Julie was saying, around looking at the way that it is weaponized and the way that it comes through in the way that big tech, you know, the platforms understand privacy and worry about privacy. So I've been doing some research with some colleagues, Callum Ward and Troy Cochrane, where we were looking at the earnings calls of the 5 big tech companies. So, you know, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook. And we took 10 years of earnings calls. You know, an earning call comes out every quarter. We took the 10 years and we looked up keywords. You know, to keyword search. We did kind of quantitative textual analysis, if you like. And there's a really interesting trend over time in which you see privacy basically comes up about 20 times a year between 2010 and 2017 across all 5 companies, and then there's a jump where it just jumps up to 80 times and then 160 times. So it's you know, it's kind of doubling as they get more and more concerned with privacy as a consequence of you know, Cambridge Analytica, basically, I think. And so this is where it comes in here. And then but it's interesting to see who's concerned about it. So it is, you know, as Julie was saying, it's being weaponized. You have Google and Facebook are being particularly kind of targeted with issues of privacy. And then Apple, you know, is standing back saying, you know, it's not, you know, we're okay with all this. So there's a quote from one of these earnings calls where Tim Cook says, CEO of Apple says, if you look at our model, if we can convince you to buy an iPhone or an iPad, we'll make a bit of money. You're not our product. So they're deliberately saying this as they're part of their kind of, you know, their arguments to investors and so on. They're trying, you know, to, you know, avoid this kind of issue, but also it's about trying to, you know, set themselves up, as Julie was saying, with this certain kind of narrative going on here.
Julie, I think you've pointed out that regulation, the kinds of regulations that come with a sort of neoliberal mindset creates new entry points for economic power, so new things. And it struck me that that was a useful way to think about some of the debates we're having in Australia at the moment, right? We had this big public fight between Google and Facebook and the Australian government recently about payment for news, you know, similar to the big fight that they've had in Europe. And so the government came out and said they wanted Google and Facebook to pay. If there was going to be no commercial deal, the government would set things like price. And then we had all sorts of behind the scenes lobbying, behind the scenes deal making around this public policy stoush and actually shaping what came out. So is this just the way things work now, that we have, you know, does this decrease the power of the state, that, you know, it tries to regulate and that just creates new opportunities for firms to exercise their power in new and different ways and shape that regulation?
So I think clearly so. I think with a caveat, which I'll get to in a moment, but many states are sort of getting played royally right now. And then there's India, right, which threatened to throw Twitter employees in jail. This is the caveat, right? There's a new social media law. You must have people on the ground and we can jail them if you don't do what we want, right? And there's Turkey. You must have people on the ground and we'll do X, Y, and Z to them if you don't do what we want. And then there's China. I won't go there at present. So there's and then there's Europe, where they issue very draconian competition rulings and large fines, but I have yet to hear of one of them actually being paid. It just sort of seems to devolve into endless negotiation. So I'm conclusion to be reaching. One of the, you know, I think it is interesting to sort of game out the Facebook Australia debacle and ask whether there is some way that it could have spun out differently, other than by the Australian government, I'm not trying to suggest it should have done this, right? You know, tossing all the Facebook employees in jail and I think it's not what I'm trying to advocate for. But it's sort of interesting to ask what could have been done more proactively, and there are places, I think, that are pressure points that have not received enough systematic attention, and they're the places where all of those disparate threads come together, right? The privacy scandals and the disinformation scandals and the competition scandals, all the threads come together around digital advertising, right? And around design for optimizing engagement, and around sort of matching up everyone in the long tail with their happy place content, which means, you know, the white supremacists get their happy place content, and so on and so forth. There's not been, I think, enough of a concerted effort across all of the governments that want to do something in a more rule of law friendly way, to really kind of bear down on the digital advertising business model in a way that, in the way that I think it richly deserves. And still, I don't think I've really, I've really told a tale of a way that Australia acting alone could have proceeded to cause things to unspool differently, but maybe somebody who is more knowledgeable about that particular situation, you know, disagrees, which it would be interesting to hear about.
As both Kean and Julie know, I have more questions, but we have a terrific set of panelists here who are likely to have their own questions about everything that we've been talking about here. So I'm going to throw it open to the panelists in the webinar. So Damien, Christine, Jake, Mark, Jeannie, Megan, and Julian and Sam, if you you may just have to put up your questions or jump in order to progress this conversation some more. Who would like to jump in first? Mark.
Thank you. Thanks to Kean and Julie for really interesting and provocative presentations. Really appreciate your taking the time. I was just thinking about something that Julie said, a kind of a side observation, but I thought it might be interesting to pick up on it and see where it leads. And that was about, you know, journalists kind of stumbling across something that's happening inside the black box, and it gets to that question of accountability. And, you know, as somebody who's been trying to do some work on accountability, of course, the challenge is all the data and all the information about the algorithms and the outcomes are all stored by the owners of the platforms. And I'm wondering if you've thought about, or either of you have thought about other possibilities for accountability, for looking at the outcomes that have been the object of concern and critique, and for also inspecting the details of how the algorithms and the sorting systems are working, you know, rather than relying on some ad hoc academics who are trying to scrape some data, or some journalists who are pulling together little tools that give them tiny peepholes into what's happening. Is there, you know, some system that might be, the other alternative, right, is I guess, you know, ban the platforms, or you know, make them public or something, but is there some institutional mechanism that might be possible for providing the type of accountability that might be more satisfactory and addressing some of the concerns that have been the object of critique?
So so this is from, in my slide deck, this was the part where I had one line and said the back half of the book talks about legal institutions, and I'm not going to talk about that here, but it's a, so I do think, so two things, right? So number one, we do kind of find ourselves in a situation like that confronted by the British Parliament in 1700 whatever, 1800 whatever, where nobody had ever invented protective labor regulation yet, and they had to imagine and then invent it, right? There are forms of governance and regulation that that don't kind of port well to this. And they're not working, right? Competition regulators are not getting enough traction. Data protection authorities are not getting enough traction. And there is definitely, there are a set of kind of imaginative leaps and institutional transformations that I think are urgently necessary. But it is also true that there is a ton of governance happening right now mostly internal to platforms and sort of shielded from the external world. And it is also true that there are sort of little nuggets of potential kind of littered across the regulatory landscape that that probably aren't being used enough because they're sort of siloed off, right? So so to take one example, at risk of sort of getting myself in trouble a little bit because my knowledge is like this deep, money center banks, right, and have to submit to audits now, right, for capital adequacy, right, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, and even to some extent before, right. There are a set of tools for that are still emergent and evolving, and there are contests over keeping those proprietary too, yes. But when we have what we have in sort of the interbank financial trading space are exactly sort of platformized algorithmic processes that can go off the rails, and their amplitudes can get so large that they can cause enormous wreck and ruin. And there are emergent protocols for auditing and benchmarking and stress testing, and we so badly need exactly that in the disinformation space, right, and in the privacy space, and to take, I think, that idea and join it and sort of pry out of platforms some of the knowledge about how they're already, right, governing and benchmarking and stress testing. It's just that the end goals that they're doing all this for are different than the ones we might want. I do think that there are building blocks that could be used to get to a space that would be sort of more pro-social, and that's kind of a challenge that that we are confronting right now.
Can I follow up?
Sure, go on, Kean.
Okay, thanks. So I was thinking there. I don't know if I have a dedicated answer, I guess, or anything but a speculative answer, I suppose. But in following up what Julie was saying about stress testing and banks, is there an opportunity to integrate some form of AI responsibility, algorithmic decision-making responsibility in in the investment community? They're getting very on board with ESG, environment, social governance risks, and so on. So if stress testing is part of it, you can incorporate it as part of the bank's own internal processes and the investment asset managers' internal processes, where they become responsible for the what the companies they invest in do. That would be another way of doing it, potentially. I have my personal kind of what I would like to see happen, which is I don't know whether this is actually possible, and Julie, as a legal scholar, is probably better placed than me to say whether it's possible, but I'd like to see some form of modular contracts, where instead of having just generic boilerplate standard form contracts that we tick with data collection, we actually have modular contracts that we can take out clauses if we want, and so we can take out the clauses which enable the use of our data forever, or that force us to use mediation when it comes to disagreements with when we want to we disagree with the companies themselves. Now I don't know the practicalities of that. I'll leave that to Julie, but I also had a kind of more I'm not sure it's facetious comment, but it's a kind of it's like if we're thinking in a Polanyian sense, what is the Spiem Hamland law for the digital age? Have we seen that already, or are we going to see that in the future? Something like the ACCC decision, is that something that could be equivalent, or has that yet to happen? That'd be another kind of interesting thing to think about.
I'd really love to pursue that. So what does the counter movement look like? But I don't want to dominate the floor here, and I know I have some questions lined up. Seth, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting couple of presentations, and it's been fascinating to come to read your work. I'm a philosopher. This is an area that's new to me, and I'm really interested in these questions of power, and in particular in the questions of the legitimacy of the power that is being exercised. It seems to me in reading your work and thinking about your work that I have this question, and I'd like you to sort of, if you could tell me whether I'm interpreting things the right way. So both of you describe the way in which markets kind of have always been, or markets in the long 20th century, as you're saying, Julie, were always kind of fictions in one sense that were legally constructed, and that you talked about as if markets, Kean, and in that sort of Posnerian sense. So bearing that in mind, to what extent do you think that the ways in which markets are being recreated in these platforms constitutes a very significant change from what existed before? And in particular, does it constitute a significant change with respect to the degree of control that a particular set of individuals or a small group of individuals has over the contours of those markets? So do we have significantly more empowered market designers than we had before? And is it significantly more removed from, if you like, the political process than it was before? So do you think that we've always been like in sort of one version of dystopia or another, where small group power over the construction of markets has been concentrated among a few unaccountable kind of extra political hands? Or do you think that the shift to platform markets constitutes a significant change with respect to those questions of degree of control, concentration of power, and political accountability?
So I guess I want to push back on how you're invoking the term markets as though we all already knew what that meant. And it's not really clear, right? And it depends a whole lot on the context. So you know, if you are an investment bank doing credit default swaps trading, there's a platform on which you can do that. And it's managed as what an economist would call, I think, a club good, right? And there are processes for being admitted to the club. If you are a Fortune 500 corporation wanting to outsource your human resources, you're going to hire Salesforce.com, and you're going to sort of, or your cafeteria workers or your janitorial workers, you're gonna bring them in through a outsourced special purpose provider. I'm just saying that and thinking, God, what I wouldn't give to be back in my office with cafeteria workers and everybody. But the fact remains, right, that it's not to ask what platforms are doing to markets sort of begs the question what we're holding constant when we talk about markets, as though we already knew what those were, and those are very different, right? And so I actually tried to write, I think it was chapter 1 of my book, the section that described what platforms were becoming without using the word market that much, because after all, my argument is that platforms are superseding the market, right, with all that entails in terms of bringing the abstract construct of the market back down to earth in these protocols and boilerplate agreements and everything that is very contextualized depending upon which set of economic exchanges we are talking about. And it's a very instructive exercise to engage in. I commend it to you all because it forces you to make concrete exactly what you mean when you say market at all. I think the word market retains a great deal of power in the political spaces, right? In what I've called the narrative spaces and the discursive spaces, where we are told, thus and such can't happen because innovation comes from the market, or some other just BS-y thing that seems to work on legislators a lot. But it's not, so I've gone on for too long already, and I see Kean kind of gesturing to weigh in. So why don't I stop?
Sorry, I wasn't gesturing. I was just nodding along with my pencil. So, but in terms of that, I think that to me, I became interested for one reason or another in contracts and contract law and its relationship to neoliberalism 5 or 6 years ago. And I started reading around contract law. I'm not a lawyer, but it it became interesting, and I wrote a little bit about it because I think there's an important missing piece when it comes to discussing neoliberalism in relation to contract. And I think that this contract has has implications here for your question, because I think you can think of platforms as being so platforms as being managed or managed through contract, where contract is a form of privately made law, and this is different from a non-platform context. Let's not say market, but let's say a non-platform context where you might have other other regulatory pressures or what have you from, say, a state that would change the balance of power, if you like. But with the platform, it's the owner of the platform that's making as I said in my brief talk, where they're making the rules, and they're the ones that are managing it through these contractual arrangements in which are one-sided, standard form, boilerplate contracts that we have very little control of.
Thanks, Kean. Damien, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talks. I found it really interesting. And I suppose my question goes back to this, the point that you were making about, companies controlling the narratives around privacy, because I found that very compelling and kind of, I suppose it matches what I've been thinking myself. And I want to kind of just get your reflections on what that means for future regulatory efforts. So Kean, you mentioned that there are plenty of draft regulations now in Europe at the moment. I mean, there's also the platform to business regulation, which was adopted, I think, last year. So there are like plenty of regulatory attempts to kind of start to counteract some of the issues that both of you pointed out, particularly in that jurisdiction. But to my mind, I think like Europe's attempts to regulate data privacy or data protection is probably the ultimate example of how companies have tried to control narratives. So I'm starting to think a little bit very cynically, or maybe I'm getting a little bit depressed about the possibility for, or the potential for a regulator to actually regulate this space. So I'm kind of just wondering about your own reflections about how we actually go about doing this. I mean, we have a regulator in Europe that is trying to do something. Is it a mere question of enforcement, or are they bad attempts at rules? I understand that it's a very open-ended and quite difficult question, but hopefully there's some sense within it that you can find in it.
So I have a little essay that got posted on the Knight First Amendment Institute website at Columbia Law School recently. It's called How Not to Write a Privacy Law. That might be interesting to on these points. There's a I think there's a kind of, this is a frame that I have become fond of using, is Maslow's hammer, right? The idea that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we've got a whole lot of regulators running around with hammers now. So we have, competition law, we have data protection law, which presumes that individual agents exercising their autonomy can make choices about their own data, right? We have in the US this bizarre construct called the information fiduciary, which some folks, including some very good friends of mine, have been trying to sell on the Hill. And it's just beyond bizarre how, to me, to think of how one could sort of take the inherently relational idea of fiduciary and blow it out to the entire tech industry. And that's another conversation, right? But what we need to do, I think, if regulators are to have something that isn't a hammer, is to sort of look at the contours of the problem. We have sort of networked products operating at scale that are governed by standards, right, and control over standards that produce effects at scale, right? So it's necessary that, so my colleague Paul Ohm calls them order of magnitude effects, right? So regulators have to learn how to sort of manage order of magnitude effects that are mediated through protocols and dashboards and indicators, right? So there's a sort of opacity problem, and there's a you know, you can never ever devolve to consumers, right, or users, or whatever you want to call them, authority to govern, because the consumer is always at the disadvantage of having their interaction mediated by the dashboard. And so you have to just kind of start, I think, with the contours of the problem and come up with some new tools. And again, I don't think it's a blank slate situation. I think inside a lot of these companies that deal with networked product/services operating at scale that produce order of magnitude effects that are accessed via interfaces and dashboards, there is a lot of thinking about how to use those to produce effects and how to govern, right? And so it's just that doesn't map in any kind of coherent or recognizable way yet to the regulatory toolkit, but there is no particular reason why that couldn't change.
And so I'll just follow up, I think, possibly in a different direction. I think that there's one of the issues here really is that there's a significant conflict around, you know, as government, the state, around privacy on the one hand, data protection on the one hand, and you know, economic concerns on the other hand. So, you know, innovation, that's you know, comes up a lot when people talk about, you know, data, digital economies, and so on. There's an example of Canada, where Canada has introduced a piece of legislation called the Digital Charter, and it introduced it in November last year. And that what in you know, reading the legislation, you can see the tension between attempts to, you know, secure privacy, data protection, with the desire to enable you know, companies to exploit data, and so that they can innovate. And so I think this tension comes up a lot. And I don't think I think the same tension comes up in the EU context. Potentially they fall more on the kind of Data Protection Privacy Act, but it's yeah. So I think that's part of this, part of this issue. You don't have you don't have a simple kind of like, we want privacy and that's it. That I do think that there's some countries that we could really learn from on this front. And I think some of those countries include the countries that have had really strong sort of data collecting state structures for a while. So Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Denmark, Finland, you know, these are countries that have been collecting personal data, including sensitive health data, for decades, and they've been collecting it as part of their welfare state. So you know, it's quite extraordinary if you go to a country like Denmark, where you have one number, that's your, you know, your, I can't remember what they call it, but it's like it's your social insurance number or whatever, you know, you have this number that connects to everything. It connects to all sorts of welfare services, and all the private sector companies have also connected to it. So there's some real benefits to it, in the sense that you move house, you update your information on your social insurance number, and it filters out. And so you know, it's not like you're contacting a dozen companies to change your details and such like. But they have they have the accountability structure for access to that data, for what you can use it for, and to, you know, for recording who's accessed it, all these sorts of things in place. That is that has taken, as I said, you know, it's decades to build up to this point, whether you have this system in place.
Thanks for that. Actually, it's interesting because we were focusing on that data and that privacy question, and I thought I might just follow up with one of the questions from the Q&A there, which is, Janet was asking, we seem to be focusing on privacy, but not on questions about how data becomes a form of value, revenue stream, a price. And we're wondering whether the panelists could say something about how their research helps us understand those questions. Just wondered whether you might have a response to that.
Sure.
Sorry, Kean.
Yeah, I can start. Julie's doesn't want to. So I just finished a paper which is looking at the data as an asset. So it's called Data as an Asset, the measurement, governance, and valuation of personal digital data by big tech. And essentially, it's trying to understand how does big tech understand personal data. And the starting point was to think, oh, big tech is turning our data into this asset. Well, let's look at what they're doing. But in exploring this question, we started looking at the balance sheets of companies, and it's you can't identify. Obviously, you can't identify the data on the balance sheets in the way because they can't. They're not allowed to call it an asset according to current accounting standards. And so we're trying to think through what is it that's being valued here. And in order to understand that, we have to understand, how does big tech make personal data? How does it measure it, and how does it make it legible as something that has value? And this process is really about trying to understand the way that big tech sees its users and understands its users and measures its users and makes its users and what its users do legible as something that can be valued. And so it's about the it's about this transformation of users, user engagement, user metrics, about trying to make those things, big tech trying to make those things, measure those things to make them legible as something that's valuable that then its investors can understand as well. And so you don't actually, again, going back to that, the research we did on earnings calls, you don't actually see the companies talk about personal data. They just, 10 years, a decade worth of earning calls. I think there were 2 mentions of personal data, which is quite extraordinary. What they're talking about is users, user engagement, monetization, user monetization, ecosystems, all these sorts of things that are very different than personal data. And so so big tech understands us as users, as people on and click on things, view things, and and that's what they're collecting. So we related this to James C. Scott's notion of seeing like a state, and so we called it techcraft. This is what they're doing, is techcraft, not statecraft, and seeing like big tech sort of thing, where they see us in a particular way that has value to them. But as a consequence, you have this situation in which there's lots of problems that are emerging here around, is all the data they're collecting, is it actually collected from people, or is it collected from bots? Is it collected from click farms, content farms, all these sorts of things that disrupt this collection and the value of what they're collecting. And so there's some really interesting dynamics that are worth unpacking around that.
So just a couple thoughts. So first of all, Kean and I have a paper in philosophy and technology called The Biopolitical Public Domain. You might want to take a look at it. It applies the Calon and Muniesa framework of markets as calculated exchanges to data. But I think the moral of the story is that that they don't talk about the value of data as such, because that's not the way the digital advertising business model works, right? What is singularized, to use that framework, for buyers is eyeballs, right? Tranches of individuals or populations or whatever you want to call them, right? And the value in the data is simply to optimize the ability to get the messaging in front of the eyeballs. The bot situation is interesting, right, in a variety of ways, because it, among other things, it does, as you note, have the potential to kind of wreak havoc with that game plan. But I think that when I think narratives are in play here too, right? When you see the message, right, your data has value, take control of your data. I think we are being encouraged to see our data as something that has value. But I think if you want to understand the way the markets work, to use that word market, which I scolded Seth for using, so sorry about that, Seth. If you want to understand the way platformized economic exchange works, over digital advertising, you need to pay attention to what is being again singularized for prospective purchasers, and it's not particularly like you, Seth, or you, Kimberly, or you, Mark, or you, Jake, right? It's population tranches. So now I just cannot resist pointing out that investor calls may not be the only place to look, right? And that this problem does not begin with personal data, right? So to my Polanyian obsession, right? We are very, very good at knowing how to have disclosure of the of sort of the widgets and bits and pieces of the industrial economy so that it may be reported to securities regulators and inform the so-called ability of capital markets to discipline themselves. We are just terribly, terribly awful at devising mechanisms to have disclosure of the value of the informational economy to securities regulators and others so that it may inform investor behavior and again, you know, empower the capital markets to discipline themselves. And it doesn't begin with data, right? There are these terms that appear in investor calls and in our securities disclosures, and they're like magic, right? Like patents, right? Trade secrets. But you never really know from reading any of the documents exactly what is done with that stuff. You never really know from reading any of the documents what is done with any other kind of data, right, that the firm may happen to have. You never really know anything about the algorithms, right? And as long as that is the situation, it is wholly, you know, it is an exercise in fantasy to imagine that investors could be making decisions that are actually informed about anything other than by their belief in magic, right? Or their trust in the VCs or what have you. And it is a systemic problem, right? That extends across not just the sectors of the economy that principally rely on personal data, but across everything that relies on intangible informational assets, which is basically everything at this point, right? And if you don't have the ability to, you know, you could do, well, I'm not gonna invent words on the spot here, but I was thinking of seeing like a state, right? And there we have fictions, right, about how our capital markets are supposed to work that entail the ability to see into it in different ways. We don't have it with personal data. We don't have it with pretty much anything else that's informational as far as I can determine. And that is a huge systemic problem. I'm not, so you know, in addition to the fact that words appear, right, in investor calls, or that words appear in securities disclosures, I think it's started to be, it has been for decades now really important to understand what is actually known about what those words signify.
Well, the tools for dealing with all of that are going to be a project. It's fortunate that we have these amazing minds thinking about that. I can't even begin to unpack all of the thoughts that we've had today, but I'm very conscious that we're now at 10:30. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to get to all of the questions, but that's the nature of the beast. These are big questions and they are going to go on for some time. And fortunately, we still have 2 more seminars in this series to keep talking about them, which is terrific. But I'll hand back to Seth now to close things off.
Yeah, so there's not much more to say besides thanks to Kim for hosting, to Julie and Kean for your presentations, and to Jake for bringing this whole thing together. It's been a pleasure to see you all, and it's been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in a fortnight's time. So thank you everybody for coming, and
thank you very much.
Keep paying attention.
Yeah.
Thanks all.